So we all know who Brandon Sanderson is and a lot of the books that he's written, but do we really know what makes him such a good writer? I started thinking about this question when someone commented on my video where we were talking about Patrick Rothfuss. The guy was saying that Brandon Sanderson has made similar mistakes to Patrick Rothfuss, yet people don't view Brandon Sanderson in the same light as Patrick Rothfuss. So it really got me wondering, what is it that makes Brandon Sanderson a good writer? And when I was kind of thinking of this topic, I kind of thought of three main things and then kind of a fourth separate thing that is part of his reasoning, in my opinion, as to why he's a good writer, but it doesn't exactly mean that he's a good writer. You'll understand when we get. Now, the first thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about what makes Brandon Sanderson such a good writer, and it was his magic systems. I think they work so well for him for a lot of different reasons, and the first one being is he uses hard magic systems with lots of rules where he lays them all out for everybody to understand what the rules are, and even when he adds elements of mystery where you're not entirely sure what could be happening next with the magic system, it all still follows the same rules, and essentially it gives everybody a trust reading the book that you're not going to have a Princess Leia in episode 8 moment and everything falls apart and you feel like you've lost the trust of the writer and just anything can happen, and it doesn't really add the suspense for certain scenes. My point is his magic systems aren't a capture all, save everything scenario kind of magic, whereas if the hero or the villain gets put into a scenario and they use magic to get out of it, you're not upset about it because you already knew that the magic was usable in that way. You didn't feel like he was just making things up because he didn't know how to get his character out of certain situations. And so really the first thing isn't necessarily magic, while it is, but it's actually more of he puts trust into his books. You understand the magic systems. They're a big element in his world, but they aren't just a reason for him to be able to fix issues that he doesn't know how to get himself out of. So in a way, he's kind of not clickbait, if that makes any sense, in his writing style. He shows you up front what he's all about and what he's writing about, and you don't really ever feel like you've been tricked into a story where you assumed they'd have a very clever way to get out of a situation, but then it turns out we'll just come up with new rules for the magic, and that's how they'll get out of it. So that's really, in my opinion, the first thing that he's really got going for him there is his magic systems and how he kind of lays a baseline trust for everybody who reads his books with those magic systems. The second thing I had thought of when I thought about Brandon Sanderson and what makes him a good writer is his world building. By no means is it the most interesting world building or the largest world building when it comes to the individual books, but it's easy to understand, it's easy to get into. He puts plenty of parallels into our real world for people to relate with, and yet he adds enough interesting elements into them to make it a different world entirely, where you don't feel like you're walking around your downtown city or whatever. He makes his worlds very accessible to whoever is reading this book and gives plenty of different types of cultures and conflicts to you to relate with and to really get into. And I think that's where his world building comes in. But he also has another added element in his world building that I kind of think helps a lot, and it's the fact that he has this massive Cosmere. Now, I think by no means is the massive Cosmere for everybody, and it's really hard to follow if you want to catch every single detail. You have to read the book several times and be very, very diligent, especially if you don't want to read the wiki. And so it's not necessarily for everybody, but for the people that it is for, people love, love, love how big the world is and how many secrets they can find and connections that they can make. And so while it's not necessarily for everybody, I think for the right people, it really draws people more and more into his world of the Cosmere. And I think that's a huge element for those people. But on the other side of things, he separates his books and his worlds well enough so that the people who aren't interested in trying to figure everything out and aren't going to be the detectives to try to decipher everything he's saying there can still just enjoy his individual books and worlds. So we got the first two things, his magic system and his world building. And now the third thing that I think is really big for him and a giant reason as to why he's considered such a good writer, and that is his communication. Now, communication is kind of a huge umbrella to put this under, but this guy is a workhorse when it comes to it. He has weekly updates. He has a podcast that I think he does weekly. The guy posts on Reddit and answers people on Reddit. He's constantly answering people's questions and trying to help other people understand his world. And he's also, more importantly than any of those other things, constantly giving us updates on his books. And so really, I think his communication more comes down to people being able to trust Brandon Sanderson and the fact that he's writing and the fact that they're going to get the next book in their series. They know he's writing. They're not nobody's particularly worried that he's not going to finish such and such series, because you can just go on his website and see how far he's completed it. And he kind of puts in blog updates, I think, sometimes to see where he's at. And now, while maybe your average reader might just kind of gloss over this point and kind of go, well, it's nice and all, but it's not that very important. But see, those are the people that I'm talking about. These people can just search Brandon Sanderson online, find his website very easily, and bam, right there, they know when they're going to roughly get the next book in the series. So they're never really completely falling off with the series, even when they're not completed. He's leaving nobody in the dark, and I think that's a huge reason as to why so many people continue to love Brandon Sanderson, and it's because they feel like he really, really cares about his readers. And honestly, it's really hard to argue with him. I think he really does. He puts so much effort into letting everybody know what's going on, what's up, how long a book is going to take. And while I personally think he could take way longer on these books to make them even better than they actually are, to finish them off, to make them absolutely perfect, you at least know what he's up to and what he's doing. Regardless of how you feel about what he's doing, you know that he's doing something. Now, this is the last thing that I was talking about, and this is sort of number 4, but not really, because this is such a double-edged sword. I don't think you can really call it one of his strengths, yet it is one of his strengths. Anyway, what I'm talking about is his prose. A lot of people have a lot of things to say about Brandon Sanderson prose, and a lot of booktubers don't like his prose, and it's kind of hard to argue with him, but this is the reason why I think it's so great, but also so bad. The reason his prose are so great, and the reason I think they work so well for him, is they're kind of generalized. And what I mean by that is, he's got no cussing, he has no sex scenes inside of them. Just the way he writes is very PG, and is able to get across tons and tons of people, millions and millions of people, in fact. And it's really hard for people to have a reason to not read his books based on the way he writes them. My point is it feels like the reason he writes the way he does is because he doesn't want anyone to ever come to him with a book and say, hey, I can't read your books because X, you cuss, or because you use these certain words or this language. I think the reason it works so well is because he generalizes, and it kind of allows for everybody to read these books without having a reason to not want to read these books. Now, that is a good thing, to get millions of people to read his books without a hurdle in the way, just to be able to pick them up, knowing that there isn't going to be anything in there that is going to keep them from reading and enjoying these books. I do think that's also part of the reason why his writing is not as good as some people say that it can. And what I mean by that is it's kind of a beginner level reading style, if that makes any sense, when it comes to bringing people into the fantasy world. It's kind of the beginner to mediocre set so that lots of people can read the fantasy world. And that's why once you've started reading tons and tons of fantasy books, and you've read really, really good authors, and you've read tons of different styles, that's why I think a lot of these booktubers and a lot of people tend to really dislike Brandon Sanderson's prose, is because now they understand how good certain people write, and they kind of look down at Brandon Sanderson's prose and say they're subpar in that sense. While they work really well for Brandon Sanderson because it brings millions of people into his books and makes him one of the most successful authors ever, on the flip side, he's never going to be considered the best writer ever, purely based on that style of writing. And I think he has his own reasons for writing the way he does and being able to bring tons of people into the world. I mean, it's no wonder that so many people choose Mistborn as the recommendation for these people who are trying to get into fantasy. It's because of how he writes. It's because of the story in general. It's really easy to hand anybody this book and just have them start reading it. In fact, I've given my mom this book. Hi, Mom. She started reading the Final Empire, I believe it is, the very first, in the first year of Mistborn. It's just really easy to recommend this series. It's not a hard read, and it's generally speaking near the top 10, if not in the top 10 of a lot of people's fantasy series. So you just know it's going to be a good series for a lot of these people. And so I think that really works out really well for Brandon Sanderson. But for people who have a higher quality taste, if you could say it in that way, that's why I think they tend to not like him as much, is because it's definitely not as high quality as some other writers when it comes to his prose. But I think that kind of only applies to people who have read hundreds and hundreds of fantasy books to understand just how good writing can be. So these are kind of my reasons why I think Brandon Sanderson is a good writer and not a good writer. With the last one there, it's kind of both. So I kind of want to know, what are your reasons for liking and or disliking Brandon Sanderson? Is there things you absolutely love about him, or the things you absolutely hate about him? What is it? Tell me in the comments. Let me know. And while you're at it, you might as well like and subscribe because, well, it's free and you can always unsubscribe later, I guess, if I end up annoying you. But that's enough for today. Put the video down and go pick up a book.